want to understand if we can actually qualify evolution as a scientific theory. Obviously, we're speaking about macroevolution. Can this be qualified as a scientific theory?
Well, we can take Darwin's words himself to answer that question. Darwin himself said that his ideas on evolution are entirely based and totally depends on Elias' geological speculations, which have since been disproved by cutting-edge sedimentology. In a letter, with regards to whether it's true science or not, his theory, in a letter to Asa Gray, he wrote, quote, "I am quite conscious that my speculations run beyond the bounds of true science. It is a mere rag of an hypothesis with as many flaws and holes as sound parts." Close quotes.
At least he's honest.
Now, the speculative nature of evolution, so obviously there's been about 150 to 200 years of time since Darwin published The Origins of the Species. And so we can also hear what others have had to say. And the fact of the matter is that there are, despite the very prevalent and dogmatic support that theory of evolution commands today amongst the scientific community, there are a leading and growing number of honest scientists that, following 150 years of fruitless searches for evidence that would support the theory, has spoken about the Darwin's theory. We have Dr. Ernst Chain, Nobel Prize-winning biochemistry, who helped to develop penicillin in 1972. He called the theory of evolution, quote, "a very feeble attempt to understand the development of life," close quote. In another statement he made, he said, quote, "I would rather believe in fairies than in such wild speculation as Darwinian evolution," close quote. We have Louise Bonouret, professor of geology at the University of Strasbourg, say, quote, Evolutionism is a fairy tale for grown-ups. This theory has helped nothing in the progress of science. It is useless," close quote. And we have Albert Fleischmann, German professor of geology, say, quote, "The Darwinian theory of descent has not a single fact to confirm it in the realm of nature. It is not the result of scientific research, but purely the product of imagination," close quote. Obviously, we don't want to appeal to authority in our discussion, but I think it's important to give a perspective on the words that Darwin himself used, but also on the words of other scientists, eminent scientists,
Sure,
that have taken a dispassionate view on the topic.
And I think this is something that's so crucial to cover, because basically, I mean, it's quite shocking, to be honest, because in most schools today, in this country, and even in, I mean, we have a brother here from India who was saying that in his education, in his biology textbooks, evolution was all over, was everywhere. So basically it's been
proclaimed as a fact.
It's proclaimed as a fact. And the thing that's quite shocking is that, I mean, as these scientists have just said, there's not a single fact which backs it up. So obviously there's something quite strange going on behind the scenes here. Anyway, so the question I have for you now is regarding Darwin's theory. What are the biggest problems that you see in his theory?
There are so many problems. I will highlight just a few, but we could have lots of talks about this. The whole thing is, as intimated by some of the earlier quotes, is full of flaws. But the fundamental issues with it are, I'll just list them quickly. First of all, evolution is not observed and is not happening today. It has not been observed in the past. It presupposes but cannot account for the origin of life. I'm talking primarily of biological evolution here. It violates an important physical law, the second law of thermodynamics. Its proposed mechanism of natural selection and mutation has been shown conclusively not to work. It fails to account for the irreducible complexity that we observe in biological systems. It fails to account for the origin of specified information in the biological systems, primarily the genetic code. And it fails because it violates many first principles in philosophy, which actually renders the very concept of evolution metaphysically impossible and hence irrational. That's just a summary of the problems, but it's
more extensive. Yeah.
More extensive.
I'd just like to ask a quick, because I mean, obviously, you're speaking to someone here who's who's very, very bad at science. I mean, yes, so biology was probably my worst subject. So could you please expand on some of the things you said? Because to a lot of it, it's like you're speaking a different language.
Yes, I mean, the purpose of these points that I'm making is really to encourage people to do their own research and to be with an open mind. It's all available, it's all out there. It's not spoken about in textbooks, but with an open mind and some research, all these can be found. And I think it's important for people to also form their own opinion about this.
Sure.
But I will just go through some of these points in a bit more detail. So the first point was that Darwinian evolution is not observed and is not happening today. So whenever experiments have been tried to reproduce or simulate the evolutionary process in the laboratory, they've always failed to produce any new species. I give a quick example. E. coli is a form of bacterium, very, very simple organism, that reproduces every 20 minutes. Because they reproduce every 20 minutes, they have analyzed it over a period of decades now. So you can recreate in the lab, you can speed up evolution, which is, according to the evolutionary theory, can take over hundreds of millions of years, and kind of recreate it by looking at these organisms that reproduce very quickly, generation after generation. You can recreate it in the lab. And the bottom line is that notwithstanding decades of these small bacteria called Escherichia coli reproducing under very favorable conditions every 20 minutes, lots of generation, recreating effectively the process of evolution, they still are bacteria. They haven't become sponges and cats or frogs and so on. They've done a lot of work has been done by a scientist called Lenski on this topic. Fruit flies, they're being irradiated with UV light to try and get mutations to change their form, and all that happens is that they just get deformed and die. They do not evolve. And we have simulations in the IT world. I mean, so the idea was, if any scientific theory, empirical scientific theory, in the modern sense of the word, should be able to be recreated through simulation. For example, in the cosmological field or the physical sciences, this is a very common thing, but it has never been able to be successfully recreated through simulations in computer science and IT. And the only way to make it work is if you introduce ad hoc interventions, meaning that you have to kind of fix the parameters in order to get the answer that you want. But that is not how evolution, in terms of the theory of evolution, is meant to work, which is meant to be a blind process with no guiding force and no intervention. So it's not happening today. It has not been observed and is not happening in the past. And that's the second point I was making. And here we have to look at the fossil record. In The Origin of Species, Darwin himself made these comments, which are very significant. He wrote, quote, "As by this theory, innumerable transitional forms must have existed, why do we not find them embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the earth?" Close quote. He himself described the lack of transitional fossils as, quote, "the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory," close quote. Now, at the time, people were saying, oh, we haven't looked around enough. We will find these fossils. Okay, so we wind the clock forward 100 years of hundreds of millions of dollars of investment to try and support and buttress the theory of evolution. And atheist paleontologist Niles Ehrlich, very famous paleontologist, in the 1970s acknowledged that despite massive efforts, nothing has changed. Quote, "It is a simple, ineluctable truth that virtually all members of a biota," which basically means a species or a category of beings, of living beings, remain basically stable, with minor fluctuations during their duration, meaning that there is no new forms that can be observed. The reality is that no meaningful fossils of the intermediate forms that are required by Darwinian evolution has been found to date. Despite the existence of billions of fossils, such a large number, incidentally, argues for a catastrophic event like the global flood. But the fact that these transitional forms, as you evolved over time from the simplest organism all the way through ultimately to man, you would expect a lot of intermediate forms,
Sure, yeah.
but they just don't exist. They haven't been found. As evolutionary atheist biologist Jeffrey H. Schwartz admitted, quote, instead of filling the gaps in the fossil record with so-called missing links, most paleontologists found themselves facing a situation in which there were only gaps in the fossil record with no evidence of transformational intermediates between documented fossil species, close quotes. These are scientists themselves saying this. What we see instead is the same living forms persisting over supposedly hundreds of millions of years of supposed evolution. There are fossils of squids that are supposed to be hundreds of millions of years old that look indistinguishable from the squids of today. Bugs stay bugs, as David Belinsky famously said. There's no evidence in the past that evolution has happened. Evolution presupposes, but cannot account for the origin of life. Scientists have never been able to generate even the very basic constituents of life from simple chemicals, despite decades of research and hundreds of millions of dollars of investment. For example, there's no assembly of amino acids, which are the constituent blocks of proteins, into proteins under abiotic conditions. And the work of James Tour, who's one of the most credentialed origin of life scientists in the world, with 800 research publications, over 130 granted patents, and over 100 pending patents, he basically indicates that there are unsurmountable technical difficulties of generating even the simplest of biological molecules, let alone any kind of simple organism, experimentally. It's impossible. This primordial soup model that you often see in many of the biological textbooks is just a fairy tale. It's a fable. Mm-hmm. It violates the second law of thermodynamics. This is a physical law that basically says that everything tends from an ordered state to a disordered state. If all the experience that we have is that all natural and physical processes, for example, solar radiation, but also rain, wind, etc., are processes of decay that eventually disintegrate all complex systems. Things will fall apart over time. Uh-huh. That's the sort of basic law that it's called the second law of thermodynamics. They can vary the existing parameters of a system. For example, iron can rust, but it cannot innovate the system and cannot change one thing into another, particularly something that is more complex and more ordered. Uh-huh, sure. And yet, we are believed that you can get through these processes, these same processes, from molecules to man, as long as we have billions and billions of years of time. Sure. But the bottom line is you cannot get order and complexity from disorder, no matter how many billions of years you're waiting. A pile of building materials will not become a house, no matter how long you wait, just by waiting for the rain and the solar radiation to make it happen. It's just not going to happen. In fact, over time, the building materials themselves will crumble and disappear.
Sure. And you might get onto this later, but an interesting thing that I heard in a talk by Father Rippiger is that he basically said, pertaining to this, he said, you can't give what you don't have, right? So a piece of bacteria can't give the complexity that a human being has. It's impossible because, basically the cause has to be greater than the effect, right? You can't create something that you don't have. I can't make you rich if I don't have $5. It's like that kind of thing. So thank you. So continue. Sorry to interrupt.
We also have the proposed mechanism of biological evolution just doesn't work. we call it genetic. It's called genetic entropy. A lot of very good work has been done by Dr. Jan Sanford of Cornell. What he did is he measured the accumulation of human mutations at around 100 new mutations per generation. Now, most mutations have a near neutral effect, are slightly deleterious, slightly negative. A beneficial mutation, things that will give an improvement, are so rare that they're not even considered, essentially. The bottom line is this: every single mutation in the genetic code over time will either have no effect or degrade functionality. They will degrade. They do not add functionality. It's a bit like if you have a piece of software and you have a bug, software bug, you're not going to get anything, an improvement in your software. It's going to degrade and probably stop working. Mm-hmm. And what John Sanford demonstrated through his work is that as humans are actually degrading, we're actually becoming dumber. We're not evolving. And interestingly, the rate of mutation tallies with the biblical chronology. That's one of the reasons why the patriarchs lived for so long, because they were closest to the perfect prototype of Adam.
That's very interesting.
And over time, all these mutations started to accumulate. And that's why lifespan decreased very significantly. We are getting a slight uplift recently, but that's nothing to do with the genetic situation. It's some improvement of sanitation and medical care.
Sure.
But in terms of our genetic patrimony, we are degrading.
Sure. That's very helpful to note. It offers a good explanation to, as you said, why the patriarchs lived for so long. Yeah.
It's also, so the bottom line is that genetic entropy has now conclusively shown that the fundamental mechanism of biological evolution, which is the genetic mutation, the idea that through genetic mutation and natural selection, you can get increased functionality, increased order, increased complexity. You can go from a molecule to a man, ultimately. Just doesn't work. The mechanism doesn't work. We have irreducible complexity in all biological systems that is, again, refuting Darwinian evolution according to Darwin's own criteria. In The Origin of the Species, Darwin said, quote, "If anyone would prove the existence of a complex organ that absolutely could not have come from a large number of consecutive changes, then my theory would completely collapse." At the time of Darwin, cells were thought to be very simple blobs of goo. But since then, we've had electron microscopy that has shown that cells are very, very highly complex, what we call nanomachinery, like machines on a very, very small scale. And they all have to be, all the functioning parts have to be present at the same time for the cell to exist and survive. Cells are literally complex cities, which within the interdependent factories and systems, like a headquarter, the nucleus, the transport system, the assembly system, manufacturing, energy production, storage, waste disposal, very intricate systems that all need to be together, otherwise the cell will just die. So this is a classic example of irreducible complexity, a bit like the mousetrap. All the components of the mousetrap need to be there at the same time and have evolved, quote unquote, evolved at the same time in order for the mousetrap to exist and to be working. Uh-huh. This is not how evolution is supposed to work. But if you have examples like a mousetrap, Darwin himself said, then my theory is false. Well, what we found throughout the biological world is massive amounts of these quote-unquote mousetraps, these machines that need all of the parts to be there at the same time for them to work. Examples of irreducible complexity. Uh-huh. So by Darwin's own criteria, his theory fails. An example I'll do very, very quickly is the cellular flagellum, which is used by bacteria for motion. It's like a
tail.
It's like a tail. You think of it as a tail. It's got all sorts of, it's made up of about 30 proteins with a filament, a hook, and a rotor. so they're very sophisticated on a microscopic scale. The rotor itself can operate at 6,000 to 17,000 revolutions per minute, although the filament, with the filament, it's constrained, so the speed of rotation is down to about 200 to 1,000 revolutions per minute. Still pretty impressive. But it fails to assemble and to therefore be functioning if only one of the 35 genes required to produce the 30 proteins is knocked out. This is an example of irreducible complexity that has been studied by Michael Behe in particular and other scientists that conclusively show that we have these highly sophisticated machines, which Darwin couldn't observe, because the techniques weren't available, but which refute his theory very clearly based on his own criteria.
So just to put this in layman's terms, just to make sure I've understood correctly, we're saying that basically this flagellum only works if all of the parts are together. So it's impossible that gradually over time each part came, because it never would have worked.
Correct.
Okay, that's very helpful. Yeah, thank you.
It also cannot account for the origin of specified information, evolution, in biological system. What do we mean by specified information? What we're referring to really is the DNA and the genetic code. What we have found is that genetic code codes for information. It's like a manual, instruction manual for the production of all the materials and the overseeing of all the activities of the cells. It's incredibly complex, it's massive, and it's made up of, so we're talking about DNA, of a very sophisticated chemical and physical language that carries meaning. Think of our language, only orders of magnitude more sophisticated. The words, I'll use simple language, you have genes, you have codons, and so on, but the concept is this. This manual is made up of millions of words. Each word carries a particular instruction or has meanings, has a particular meaning. But the words are so sophisticated, in fact, that if you read the word in one way, you get one instruction. If you read it in the opposite way, you get a different instruction. You have mechanisms that translates those words into a different language, which then can be read to deliver other instructions. If you read the third word, the third letter of those words, of multiple words, you get a further instruction. What we are seeing is a level of complexity and sophistication which dwarfs our own human language.
Yes.
Imagine, just as an exercise, trying to find a word of 12 letters that gives you one meaning if you read it one way, another meaning if you read it another way, another meaning if you only read the third letters of that word, and another meaning if you translate that letter into a new language. It's just unfathomable. It's impossible. Yet this is what the DNA that we have in each of the cells of the body and that every organism has can do. So where does that come from?
It's beautiful.
Where does that come from?
The mind of God. Yeah.
So any evolution theory cannot count the origin of the specified information, even though they presuppose it in a sense, because without that first replicating organism, there would be no evolution according to them.
Sure.
And lastly, I would say that evolution breaches a number of self-evident first philosophical principles, and I think you were referring to some of those earlier. But these philosophical first principles are principles that do not depend on other principles to exist. They are self-evident. They cannot be proved, but are intuitively true. And our intelligence, our intellect, gives instant assent to them when they're presented to the intellect. For example, the principle of identity. A thing is what it is, or the principle of non-contradiction. A thing cannot be in the same place and with the same respect to another thing at the same time and in the same place. So you have these...
Something can't be, for example, here and there.
At the same time.
At the same time in the same formality. Yeah.
Correct. So if Darwinian evolution has to be true, it has to adhere to first principles. And if it doesn't, because first principles reflect the objective order of things, they reflect the fundamental structure of reality of the created world. So if Darwinian evolution fails to adhere to those first principles, then by definition, it can't be a valid theory. But the problem is we find that Darwinian evolution violates many first principles, which follows that it must be false in whole or in part. And what are those first principles? You mentioned one of them, the principle of sufficient reason. Either the existence of a thing is unaccountable either in itself or in another. You can't give what you don't have. If I don't have $1 million, I can't give you $1 million. If I don't have eyeballs as an organism, I can't give them to the one that is more sophisticated to me, the next one up the ladder.
And the primordial soup doesn't have eyeballs.
Primordial soup doesn't have eyeballs. Nor does the first amoeba, to be fair, but the primordial soup doesn't have lots of stuff that the first amoeba has. So the first microorganism.
Sure, okay, yes.
The principle of proportional causality. No effect is greater than the cause. You mentioned that earlier. But here we have a systematic violation of this in Darwinian evolution. Life coming from non-life, multi-celled life coming from unicellular life, swimmers from non-swimmers, walkers from non-walkers, flyers from walkers, and so on.
Sure, okay.
It's a constant violation. Principle of resemblance or continuity of nature. Like begets like. All life comes from life. So a dog is going to beget a dog. It's not going to beget a cat or an ape. If I plant my my tulips put some seeds or I plant a flower, I'm going to get the flower that I know I planted, not some other flower.
Yeah, sure. That's the thing. It's actually quite useful, I think. I was thinking about this the other day. Like, if you actually think logically about how things reproduce, this is a helpful way to basically dispel this concept of evolution. Because if you're within a species, right, you have a dog, and you follow the genealogy of the dog, let's say over like 1,000 years. I mean, how on earth are you going to get a cat? Like, do you see what I mean? Because it's just going to stay within the same species. Like, the dog breeds with another dog and gives you a dog, which breeds with another dog and gives you a dog. How on earth do you eventually get a whale? I mean, it's just a completely different it's a different essence. So that's something that's, I mean, very simple.
What they do is they use time. They basically say, well, over billions and billions and billions of years, you are going to get a little change here and there, and it's going to kind of suddenly a fin is going to come out.
I see. Okay.
And that's the use time. But the problem is that fails on all sorts of different dimensions, and we're not going to go into into it too much detail. But all these other things I mentioned just.
Sure.
And then the last one, I would just say the logical principle. So far, we've talked about real principles, which have to do with the being itself, or the being of a thing. Logical principle, which have to do with how we know about something. And this is the principle of evidence that is refuted. And basically, an explanation or hypothesis must take into account all of the evidence. And a single piece of evidence that is contrary to or cannot be accounted for by the theory renders the theory false in whole or in part. And we have seen lots of them already, and there are many more that we can't really explore in this talk. But evolution is not observed, absence of fossil intermediates, irreducible complexity, and genetic entropy. Those facts taken singly alone suggest, according to the principle of evidence, that the theory is either false, either in its entirety or in part.
Sure.
And here we have lots of them.